Okay, yes, thanks Phil, and thanks Dennis. Hopefully, to some extent, we'll address an issue there regarding incentivization of management practice change. I just wanted to, up front, notice our contributors and our funders, EPRI, NAS, KBS, LTR, and Queensland University of Technology. So yeah, a quick presentation overview. Initially, I'll just outline some objectives, talk very briefly about the carbon offset market, introduce nitrous oxide and nitrogen management. Most people will be aware of them. I just want to go through it briefly. Talk about our project overview, what it entails, some protocol development, some specifics, some results of the protocol that we have, and some conclusions. So what's the main objective of the work that we've been doing over the last few years from these various funders? To develop and implement an agricultural end-to emissions reduction protocol for the US carbon offset market, if that ever comes about. It's been postponed again today for some other later announcement. With potential for widespread farmer adoption. No point in producing a great, beautiful model protocol. No one can either fathom it or use the inputs or even apply it. Just a quick schematic screenshots of some of the entities and organizations that are out there that deal with the US carbon offset market and which may be potentially involved in future cap and trade scenarios. Western Climate Initiative, VCS, Voluntary Carbon Standard, Chicago Climate Exchange, maybe most people are familiar with because MSU is part of the Chicago Climate Exchange, RGGI, RGGI, Climate Action Registry, etc. So a lot of organizations out there are, to some extent, preempting potential legislation coming out there and hoping to involve themselves in these offset management and offset protocols which are linking in with the agriculture and forestry sectors, the ability to have protocols which enable capped entities to be able to trade the offsets which are generated by reductions in mitigation in these non-capped, the agriculture and the forestry sectors. So just nitrous oxide, I probably don't want too much detail here. Foam primer in the soil, Phil gave that detailed schematic before. Roughly 50% of N2O from agricultural soils. Contributes to global warming, it's got a high global warming potential. Ozone destruction, and another term that's happy to use is that 1 ton of avoided N2O emissions is roughly the equivalent of 298 in this case tons of sequestered CO2. So very high, if you like to call it a low-hanging fruit with a high GWP. So just for emphasis there, which it's not helping me at the moment, but nitrogen management. Anyway, so typically when we talk about nitrogen management, there's a 4R scenario which has been touted about quite recently through the IPNI and other organizations: the right product, the right rate, the right time, and the right place. And what our current understanding is of the US Midwest with regards to row crop studies and literature reviews is that N fertilizer rate is typically the best predictor of N2O emissions. So we're not talking about in these projects going to every site and measuring N2O emissions directly from chambers. We're trying to use a proxy in order to try to estimate and predict what the N2 emissions will be. So the right rate is what we're trying to be concentrating on here, although of course I'm very aware that all these other management factors influence, all environmental factors influence. So I'm trying to some extent simplify and create a protocol which is transparent for people to be able to use. So here's a project overview. A colleague of ours, John Hoban, did a lot of work on farmer fields, on producer fields in Michigan. 5 sites are highlighted there on the map. 8 site years in total, a typical corn soybean rotation as we talked about, conventional tillage, so very typical management practice for the region. 6 fertilizer rates, you'll see in the top right there, there's some little schematic there of the rates that we've looked at, all the way from 0 all the way up to 225 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, about 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Static chamber methodology, basically collecting gas samples from chambers in the field, taking them to the lab, analyzing them, and calculating flux rates. So what is the basis of this protocol we're trying to get at here? It's got empirical field data, as I pointed out. There's a biological basis for what we're trying to tout as a good approach for this protocol, and I'll go into a little more detail later. We're using N fertilizer rate as the proxy for N2 emissions. We're not measuring them specifically when we're talking about the projects, but we have measured them specifically and in great detail, statistically and scientifically robust method of actually generating this data. What we're looking at here is a regional emissions factor for hopefully Michigan and hopefully the Midwest in general, which future work will hopefully be able to expand and maybe determine more regionally specific emission factors for other crops and regions in the US and beyond. And what we're talking about here is generating credits, greenhouse gas credits, and carbon dioxide equivalents from the actual reduction in fertilizer N rate. So just moving on here is a couple of the graphs, well, one graph in particular, the one on the right, which I don't want to take too much detail into, but what it shows is the fertilizer N rate on the x-axis, N2 emissions on the left. And what it shows there, over all these 8 site years that John was working on this, it generates a non-linear relationship, a very statistically robust non-linear relationship. It's actually an exponential relationship you see there. And I'm trying to contrast that with what the default factors are from the IPCC, the UNFCCC, where they have a very static, non-linear, constant emission factor associated with the relationship between N rate and N2O emissions. So a linear relationship, it's a default value, and there's been criticism of this before, is to extrapolate it to large areas, but it's still routinely and currently used in many other country inventories for estimating N2O emissions from managed land. So it's very, very relevant and used these days quite a lot. What we have here, as I say, is this exponential relationship. It's a regional value which we can justify through all our field work on producer field sites in Michigan. So we're going to take these two relationships and talk about the implications with regards to emissions reduction and project incentivization for management change, practice change at the farm field site. Just want to bring it to some context here, more of a, if you like, an economic approach or an economic incentive. What we have here is just the corn nitrogen rate calculator from Iowa State University. Don't take too much detail of the actual the text there, but what it is a number of Midwestern states have proposed a different approach to recommending N rate recommendations, not based on typically what was happening before, which was a yield recommendations and multiplying by certain factors to generate N rate recommendations. This is taking an economic optimum nitrogen rate approach, many sites in a number of these Midwest states, and generating what we'd call a maximum return to nitrogen. The maximum return to nitrogen is the economic optimum for the average of the sites in the state. So it's the economic optimum for all the sites in the state averaged together. So you see, for Michigan, just take an example, calculating that as 127 pounds of N per acre, and there's an economically profitable range around that, roughly $1 per acre, plus or minus, which gives you roughly a 20 pound per acre a range of profitability. So what we have here on the right-hand side is, again, a screenshot from this Conrad N calculator. It's looking at yield. A lot of the criticism or debate is whether, sure, you're reducing N rate, so you're reducing yield. Well, not necessarily. In fact, to some extent, not always at all. There's a real, I don't want to use the word over-fertilization. We've been in meetings last week in Chicago where the term over-fertilization was seen as a negative. So higher fertilization rates are typically, not always, but above what we classify as an economic optimum N rate. So it's not to criticize the farmer for over-fertilization. It's just he is using at current a higher N rate than would potentially be economically the best for him and the region as a whole. So what we see here is if we take this MRTN high rate to the MRTN low rate, what effectively we're doing by reducing that N rate from the higher to the lower is generating a reduction in nitrous oxide emissions and generating a credit, a potential credit in terms of CO2 equivalents for the change in management practice. And what you can see here is that actually even from this low reduction in N rate, really, maybe only 15% of his total N rate, the yields that you're talking about here are very, very negligible, statistically probably not important. And particularly if you're thinking of higher along the x-axis when you're looking at 180 to 200 pounds of N, you'd still be actually at that flat level, that plateau level, which is effectively the agronomic optimum of the site anyways. So you take a lot of reduction of N rate to get down to what you'd classify as a non-economic optimum. So yeah, just as a graphical representation of those two approaches, the default linear approach from the IPCC and the non-linear exponential emission factor approach that we have from our regional work. What you see here is that a linear emissions reduction generated from the reduction, and I've converted units here to kilograms of N per hectare, so that represents that MRT in high to low rate. What you see here is with that reduction at value A, linear reduction would generate you 0.3 of a kilogram of nitrous oxide nitrogen per hectare per year. What you see with the exponential relationship that we found, that would generate a much larger reduction in N2O emissions, which when you convert it to CO2 equivalents, effectively further incentivizes the farmer to be able to reduce his N rate, gives him a bigger payback, if you like, for his same reduction. So, the carbon offset credits, what is that, in fact, the potential impact of the simple protocol I'm trying to outline? A linear reduction, again, back to the pounds and rather than kilograms. It's fun for me, you come from the UK to do this. So 139 to 118 pounds. In truth, not generating a huge amount of tons of CO2 equivalents per acre per year, but if we possibly be more realistic about our N rates and look at the exponential relationship, you see that if a farmer currently is looking at over 200 pounds of N, he's then reducing maybe 10, 15%, so up to 190 pounds, still what we consider above the economic optimum. You're generating much, much, much more carbon equivalent credits, which could be paid to the farmer for his management practice change. And that figure there, that 0.6 tons, is actually the equivalent of what the CCX is currently offering, the Chicago Climate Exchange is offering for a conservation tillage practice. It's actually the maximum allowable paid to project developers in the US, 0.6 of a ton of CO2 equivalent per year. And that represents a relatively small reduction as a percentage of an N rate. So if you can imagine 225 to 150, you'd be way up higher than current conservation tillage practice rewards for a change in practice. If we really want to take the extrapolation of this scenario to an extreme, which I like to do, currently last year, 2009, 86 million acres of US farmland planted to corn in 1 year. You take that 0.6 of a ton for each acre, there's a potential reduction there of 52 million tons of CO2 equivalent per acre per year for one crop. And I understand the ramifications of what I'm doing, but it's still, there's a large potential there you can see from the figures I'm presenting. So what is, in conclusion, what do we think this protocol brings to the table? The attributes, it's very scientifically robust, farmers' fields, the statistics are there, lots of complex statistical maneuverings that John did, but in essence, we found that the exponential relationship in Michigan under the conditions we had was by far the best relationship we had with N rate. There's environmental integrity to it. It's transparent, hopefully, to all stakeholders. It's a relatively simple relationship, a proxy for N2 emissions, i.e. N rate. Hopefully it's cost effective. It should not, this is not a full economic analysis I want to point out, but the farmer is in effect, at least on a simple level, not losing anything. He's not losing yield, he's reducing his N rate, he's reducing his fertilizer costs, and he's possibly, hopefully, depending on the price of carbon, which is quite low at the CCX at this moment, he's actually going to have an incentive, an extra, if you like, over the hump incentivization to reduce some N rate, so he actually might get some credit back from the CCX or other organizations that are out there. What does the protocol hopefully provide? It minimizes productivity loss, it negates it in some extent. It provides an economic incentive, which is, in truth, possibly more important than an environmental incentive. The MRT N rate provides that, certainly in the Midwest and the 7 states we've been talking about. There is the environmental incentive, thank goodness. There is N2 reduction around, there is CO2 equivalent reduction involved. And hopefully, depending on all other factors which Adam and Ruben may talk about after the session, these emission reduction credits are fungible. They could be tradable with some of the cap and trade entities, the cap and trade scenarios, or the cap markets that we're hopefully or potentially going to be seen in the future. So with that, I want to thank you and open the room to questions.
Take a couple of minutes for questions and then.
Sure.
Is there a difference between the carbon credits if you're using urea 28 or anhydrous?
No, it's the MRT N rate is based on an N price, a fertilizer N price, and a corn price. And it discussed, I didn't show it in detail there, but there are ratios of whatever that cost, you project your cost of what you're going to get for your corn and how much you pay for your fertilizer. So there are options on the ratio, 5 to 110 to 150 to 121, and that determines the plateauing and the MRT N rates. But there's no difference in the actual N type, and that's what I was alluding to before, where this is N rate irrespective of the N source. So urea, ammonium nitrate, CAN, whatever. This doesn't take into context the N type. There's a lot of evidence both ways, but it's very much more difficult to quantify an N type fertilizer with regards to an N2 emission reduction. And there's lots of slow release enhanced efficiency fertilizers which are on the market now, which are trying to show that there's a greater increase in end-use efficiency in these systems, and that would also include the potential for reduction of N2 emissions. Not quite there yet with regards to the quantification of those products as to how they affect N2 emission reductions over an annual cropping season.
Pardon me if you said this already, but do you have a sense of the baseline of the in-rate practice currently, and is there a lot of potential here in, say, Michigan? And then also, how would you envision sort of verifying this for a carbon program?
Big questions, and as I say, we recently went to a meeting in Chicago which talked a lot about this work. Baselines, I can speak from what we're thinking about it. A lot of our work, some information from the voluntary carbon standard, for instance, talk about fertilizer management records being used as a baseline. So in 5 or 10 years, if a farmer has records with the nutrient management plans or other programs he's involved in, a farmer would typically have a relatively good set of data on what he applied to various crops in various parts of his field. So you could envisage potentially a 5 or a 10-year average, a running average of the previous N rate that he applied. So whether it's 201 year, 180, 170, 250, average that over 10 years, or a rotation just with corn within the corn soybean, generate a baseline and assume that is the, if you like, the standard practice or common practice for that site. and then any reductions below that average, depending on if you want to introduce a threshold, maybe you need to maybe reduce by 10% to start getting the credits, or even small incremental reductions, maybe even generating the credit. Obviously, the greater reduction, the greater credit you generate. But use management records, use the farmer's individual site practices to generate the baseline for the future project reductions. And the other one's verification. Yeah, sure, that's an awkward one. I mean, I can speak for the CCX to some extent. They have aggregators which they use to do a lot of this verification. North Dakota Farmers Union are the big contributors to the CCX, and they typically sample small percentages of each of the people or each of the farmers that enroll each year. So they go around, do desk reviews, site studies, soil tests, plant tests, aerial mapping, just ways of verifying that the farmer, not every single contributor to it, but an attempt to get a representative sampling of all the people who are involved in these offsets. So there's definitely ways to do it. It depends on your version of what's acceptable.
Well, thanks, Neville.
Thank you.
Great questions, and we'll be hearing more about carbon and carbon offset markets, greenhouse gas markets in the next session, which will start in 15 minutes after a break. So please come back.